Hi everyone, good evening. Welcome to the virtual Gender Justice, Women in Prison Sentencing event. And today we have the speakers of Carole Alden, who is an artist and activist, as well as Ashley Nellis from the Sentencing Project. And today's subject for tonight's our speaker series is gender justice within the U.S. prison system.
You want me to take over from here?
Oh, yes, please.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Allison Weiss, and I'm the director of Sandy Spring Museum, and I want to thank you for coming this evening. We always start our programs with a statement, which I want to share with you. During these trying times that we have experienced as individuals and as a country, Sandy Spring too has experienced challenges grappling with the role that we play in a system that benefits some at the expense of others. Sandy Spring Museum stands firmly with those fighting against racism, structural disadvantages, and systemic injustice that have oppressed Black people in the United States for hundreds of years. The United States was built on discriminatory practices that were codified in our legal system, beginning with the dehumanization of Native people, followed by enslaving Black people in bondage as property for the financial benefit of those of white European ancestry. Sandy Spring Museum itself stands on land that was once a plantation where Black people were enslaved. We recognize that the museum is a beneficiary of a historically unjust system, and we're committed to working toward dismantling systems that perpetuate racism and discrimination in order to build a just, equitable society. Tonight's program is one of many programs that we host that challenge the dominant narrative. This evening's program is being held in conjunction with an exhibit that we're showing right now, which is called Incarceration and Creation. All works of art by people who were either formerly incarcerated or are currently incarcerated. And we're hosting this project in conjunction with Justice Arts Coalition. So I want to take a second to just introduce our speakers, one of whom is exhibiting at the museum right now as part of this exhibit. Is Carole Alden, who is a visual artist who was incarcerated in 2006 for an act committed in self-defense after severe domestic violence. She served 13 years of a 15-year prison sentence, where she continued to create art against all odds, developing whimsical wildlife sculptures, as well as a body of work that reflects experiences of women dealing with domestic violence and the legal system. Her long-term goal is to create a space for survivors of trauma to attend retreat workshops that explore healing trauma through art. And we also have with us this evening, Ashley Nellis, who is a senior research analyst from the Sentencing Project. The Sentencing Project promotes effective and humane responses to crime that minimize imprisonment and criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice. Dr. Nellis has an academic and professional background in analyzing criminal justice policies and practices, racial disparities, juvenile justice systems, and long-term imprisonment. Her documentation of the prevalence of life imprisonment has served as a national resource for academics, advocates, policymakers, reporters, and incarcerated persons. And with that, I would like to turn the program over to our speakers.
Thanks, Allison. Who is going to be going first, Carole or me?
Sorry, you can start.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And it's good to be here, even if it's just virtually. As Allison mentioned, I've been studying life imprisonment for a long time now, about 13 years. And in the last year, I've been focusing on women serving life. And, that has not been as much of an urgent matter over these years because there are not as many women serving life by far as men. Women make up about 3%. of the lifer population, which is about 7,000 women overall. And of those, about 2,000 are serving life without the possibility of parole, which is the focus of my research this year. Um, I want to just tell you a little bit about who they are as a profile, and then hand it over to Carole to, give the real life story. Um, so most of the women serving life sentences come in on a life a little bit older than men, usually in their mid 30s, and they are often have been convicted of a homicide if they're serving life, slightly more so than men, and they also are predominantly white, which is a difference between men and women in prison generally, and also in the lifer population. Um, women are, Black women are still disproportionately represented in terms of their representation in prison overall. So, for instance, in Louisiana and in Pennsylvania, about 1 in 10 Black women who is in prison to begin with is there for a life sentence or life without the possibility of parole. Black women tend to come in on a life sentence sooner than white women, which suggests some support for research we've seen elsewhere that Black people generally are believed to be younger and more culpable than whites. And so we see them enter the criminal justice system at earlier ages, even for serious crimes. Um, Life without parole for women has been growing at a very rapid rate, much more so, almost twice as quickly as for men. So since 2008, when we first started collecting data on life sentences, we found like about a 45% increase in the number of women serving life without parole. And this is troubling and difficult to understand, without knowing too much more about their crimes. We do know that women who enter the criminal justice system, and particularly those who enter on a violent offense, have endured substantial amounts of trauma, and that this trauma plays out differently for women than it does for men. Often it's related to domestic violence, and often it includes sexual violence, which is a different dynamic than what we see with men. Men certainly experience trauma. Men who come in on a life sentence also experience trauma, but it's different. It's a different level. It's usually childhood trauma, as opposed to the sort of ongoing trauma in a marriage type of thing, where physical violence is a regular day-to-day experience. So the focus, of our work together with a couple of other organizations this year is to really shed light on that unique characteristics of women who are serving life sentences, and to try to get legislation passed in certain states that look ready to do so, where experience of domestic violence would be used as a mitigating factor, either during the trial, or if it wasn't used during the trial, can be used retroactively. So in 2019, the state of New York passed a law called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. And what that does is allow women, usually women, but anyone, who are who basically present to the court and say, my experience of domestic violence was not either introduced or taken seriously or used as a mitigating factor in my crime, and I would like for that evidence to be reconsidered now, and I apply for resentencing as a result of that. And so that New York law has passed. It's been in effect. Some women have been released as a result of it, and there are other states who are poised to introduce legislation as well. Oregon, Minnesota, California has a form of that in place, and Hawaii. So there are reasons to be optimistic that the that these experiences that domestic violence survivors have are important, and they are often intimately related to the crime that they end up committing, and that is a different that's a different kind of person that goes into prison, right, than somebody else. So the risk of somebody who goes in with the experience of domestic violence and having perhaps killed their abuser is that they have very low chance of committing another crime because their crime was very incident specific. And so there, is a very good argument to be made that it is a waste of tax dollars to imprison somebody for life or really any term of years if they were really doing it in self-defense or as a result of long-term trauma from intimate partner violence. So I think with that, I'll open it up and ask Carole to share your story. And then I think we're taking questions and comments and all of that after Carole.
Oh, it's really interesting to see other states handling the domestic violence issue as far as sentencing is concerned. The state of Utah has spent over $1 million just incarcerating me after, a prolonged period of time where I'd been restrained and beaten and tortured and, had my pets set on fire in front of me, threats to my children's and my grandchildren's lives, this sort of thing. They had just passed a law stating that if anybody was involved in domestic violence, that somebody would be removed from the home if you made a call. And that was the impetus for me feeling brave enough to even call the police. But my experience was that even though the man had fled the home, was drunk, high, had paraphernalia on him, driving illegally, etc., all they did was give him a ride home and tell me that I could always just call them again. So, it's great to have laws, but law enforcement has to enforce them. And in rural Utah, that was not the case. And then when you get to the point of being charged for the incident that occurred, my experience was that they look at things that men do as a crime of passion. It's like, well, he was having an emotional episode and he just couldn't help himself. And so a man might get a 5-year sentence for committing a homicide, and a woman, they'll say, well, you knew better. You're intelligent. So you get the full sentence of 15 years or life or whatever. I was originally charged with a 20 to life and ended up with a plea bargain of a 1 to 15, which meant I never had a trial. And most of the information having to do with the abuse was, just kind of shoved under the rug. It was never even entered into the court as far as any kind of mitigating circumstance at all. And then when you get to prison, they started this thing in Utah called gender responsive training for the officers. Now, when you have a title like that and you put it out in the media, it sounds really progressive. And people think, oh, well, they're actually paying attention to women's needs. The reality is that they do studies to figure out what's the best way to manipulate female inmates. How do you get them to comply? What are they afraid of losing the most? Contact with their children. They realize that women, by and large, care about how their actions affect somebody else. So if somebody protests against something that is unjust, they take them in a room and say, well, if you don't shut up about this, then we're going to take whatever privilege or thing away from everybody. And by and large, women will say, okay, never mind. I don't want to cause that kind of suffering to everybody else just because I've been treated badly. The men, on the other hand, would, stand their ground and say, nope, we're going to strike, we're going to, riot, whatever. They get organized, and they're not afraid of threats because they don't really care what the outcome is, as long as they have their say. Women are very different in an incarcerated setting. We have, if we think we're going to lose our phone calls or our visits, women cave. And it's really hard to get people organized in a female institution to get things to change. It has to happen from the outside in order to be effective. So it's really important to get the stories out. But like, for example, with trying to do artwork, there's a lot of places right now that really encourage creativity within the incarcerated population. In Utah, however, they made it very difficult. To begin with, the materials were extremely expensive. Then you had to have a property contract, which was signed by everybody from the deputy warden on down to the sergeant in your unit. Usually about 5 signatures in order to have permission to make a piece of art. And I'm talking about just crocheting something, even if you just wanted to make baby booties or a blanket or beanies, you had to have all this permission. You had to provide receipts for your yarn and your crochet hooks and say exactly what color things were going to be. And certain colors weren't allowed. Like, you couldn't make anything out of that had gang colors like red or blue. And even then, and so it would take months to get this approval to do a project. And, which is, when you're trying to do Christmas and birthday gifts for your children or your grandchildren, it's just, it makes women really depressed because they know that they're not going to be able to do things for the people that they care about in a timely fashion. And so it makes it look like you don't care. And you get to the point where you have all this stuff done, you're ready to ship it out, and then they send SWAT in and they just destroy everything. They take it all away. I had special permission at one point to do a series of pieces for domestic violence shelter in Salt Lake. They were doing an exhibit, and all the proceeds were donated to them. And 2 weeks before I was supposed to ship things out, they came in and took everything away from me. And the lieutenant came in and, I reiterated that I have a contract. You guys all signed it. I'm doing everything according to your rules. And his response was, well, let me see your contract. And I handed it to him, and he says, well, I'm rescinding it right now, and tore it up. And they took all my artwork and all my supplies. And, there was no reason for any of this other than their need to just accentuate that they're in charge and you are nothing. And for the most part, my feeling ended up being that the way women are treated in prison just accentuates the abuse that we've already experienced. It's like the system takes up where an abusive spouse left off. They treat you the same way. They talk to you the same way. They call you the same names. They degrade you the same way. They scrutinize you the same way. There's really not a clear path for women to recover when they've gone through maybe decades of abuse, through childhood and adulthood. and then they go into the system like that. How do you heal from that? And this is where we really need to look at the systems that are in place, and especially how officers are trained. And people need to have some dignity when they're in these kinds of situations. And even if everybody needs to be kept safe and everybody has to be strip searched and all of this, there are still ways to do that with some dignity instead of going out of your way to degrade somebody that's already traumatized. It was a fascinating experience for me. I'd never lived a criminal lifestyle. I didn't fit the profile of the majority of the women who were in there that were maybe second, third generation substance abusers, who had family members scattered throughout the system. I was, a really different color of fish in there. So I didn't fit in, and I sat back and I paid attention and I watched and I listened and I saw how people were treated and the differences with both gender and also race. For example, I witnessed a fight between a white supremacist woman and a Hispanic woman. And it was just a fist fight out in the yard. It wasn't, there weren't any weapons or anything. And SWAT came in and they restrained the white woman and just, they zip tied her, but they let her sit there on the ground. And the Hispanic woman, who was not fighting them, they knocked her down, kneeled on her, zip tied her, and then emptied an entire canister of pepper spray in her face, maybe an inch from her eyes. And, this is while she's not struggling, nothing, no resistance whatsoever. So, you saw instances of brutality like that all the time. I mean, I had an officer put his boot on my neck one time while he was telling me to explain why I had so many skeins of yarn, because heaven knows what I might do with that. It's just unreal. And when you try to explain to people how things are,
that's why. Or maybe you turned off your right. Oh wait.
So what do you attribute your ability to get through all of that, Carole?
Well, I focused on my artwork, really. Some of it just to try to give joy to other people, and some of it to work through, the trauma. And I had a therapist tell me that since I was an artist, I should draw how I felt. So I drew pictures of this monster that, was just shredding a woman basically alive. And she was like, "Oh, you don't feel very good, do you?" It's like, "No, I don't." No. I mean, they have classes here and there, but you're only allowed to take them for maybe 9 weeks. And if you've had domestic violence your entire life, 9 weeks does not fix it. Therapy needs to be an ongoing thing in an environment like that.
So Ashley, is Carole's story typical of what your research is?
It's definitely typical of what I've heard from other women serving time in prison, either for life or less than life. That there's a most of the correctional officers are men. There is a certain sort of degradation, I think, that women describe that I don't hear as frequently from men. In terms of the power relationship between the COs and the inmates. And there's this, just sort of a general disregard for, women's needs in there, either for therapy or education. A lot of the facilities, I know one um, woman was recently telling me that in her facility, there wasn't a law library, but in the men's, because there's several men's facilities, there are law libraries. So, women suffer in that regard as well. So yes, it's not uncommon.
Yeah, we didn't have a law library in our women's facility, and the men did.
Mhm. Mhm. So Ashley, can you speak at all, like, is there any information historically about why there is this disparities in sentencing between men and women in crimes like this? You're muted.
I think women's sentences are getting longer in some for homicide. Some of it is because there are laws now that, and this is not Carol's story, but there are laws now that require the same sentence for the primary actor in a crime as well as all of the auxiliary actors. So sometimes it's called law of parties or felony murder. So somebody who is a lower level participant in a felony that results in a murder. In certain states, Pennsylvania and Louisiana, for instance, it's a mandatory life without parole for everybody. And the reason why that matters is that women are in sort of not in the non-domestic violence types of homicides. Women are more likely to play sort of a less primary role, a secondary or tertiary role in the homicide. And so before they may have been not sentenced to life, they might have gotten a term of years, but now they're getting life because of these mandatories that don't discriminate between people who played a primary role and people who didn't. That's one explanation. We don't know enough about the population, the proportion of women serving life for homicide where it was domestic violence related. We expect to find that out in the next couple of years because that's a primary focus of both myself and some others. But we know anecdotally that a lot of women, most women, were involved in very toxic and usually violent or at least coercive relationships that are related directly or indirectly to their crime.
How does this compare to the way women are treated in other countries for similar crimes?
Well, I mean, it depends. There's some countries that that will not imprison women who have children. There are some countries who are, will not really imprison anybody for more than 20 years, regardless of what their crime was. And then there are some countries who execute women. So, there are, it runs the gamut. I think in countries that we'd like to be more like, they limit the use of incarceration for everybody, including women, especially women who have children, because of the harms done to the whole family.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, Carole, do you mind if we ask why you accepted the plea bargain?
Well, primarily it was because I didn't have access to legal representation. There was one public defender for the county, and he was an alcoholic, and he ended up being removed from his position about a year after my case. And I had hoped to appeal it on the basis of incompetent counsel, but because I didn't have access to a law library, I didn't know when the deadlines were and how to file things. And so by the time I figured anything out, it was too late for me to do anything. And it was, you know, I felt like I didn't have a choice just because I didn't have enough information. And in retrospect, I probably would have been better off going to trial, because then I would have had access to appeals. But when you take a plea bargain in Utah, that's the same as saying, yep, I'm guilty. You know, I don't need to talk about it anymore. And so you don't have the option of appealing under most circumstances if you take a plea bargain in Utah.
There's a question in the chat, but I just wanted to follow up with that. Ashley, what do you see? Do you see that people normally take plea bargains, or they're more likely to go to trial? And if they go to trial, are women more likely to be convicted, or is it hard to say what the trend would be?
Yeah, I don't know what the gender differences are, but I do know that, about 95% of cases go to plea. And that sometimes when it goes to trial, there's what's called a trial tax, which is, and it's not a formal thing, it's a trial bias. Judges are likely to give a longer sentence to somebody who goes to trial rather than taking a plea, because of the sort of costs that that defendant has imposed on the system by taking their case to trial. I mean, none of that is at all fair. You have a right to trial, and all of that by the I think it's the Sixth Amendment. But judges there's quite a bit of evidence that a trial tax is imposed when cases go to trial instead of they turn down a plea and go to trial.
And who pays the tax?
Well, it's not a real tax. It's it's a punishment tax. So they get a longer sentence.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, wow.
Yes, right.
Okay. Wow. So there's a question for Carole. Can you share how you've been able to reclaim your life since you've been out of prison, and how have you continued your artistic practice?
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, when I first got out, I found that I didn't have access to any of the, pardon? Anyway, I wasn't able to access any of the programs that they had for people that get out, just because I didn't have any parole stipulations as far as mental health or substance abuse. So I was kind of on my own. And I had an awesome parole officer, which you don't normally hear, but he basically told me that he felt like I would be successful if everybody just got out of my way. So that was his goal, was to just leave me alone and let me do what I needed to do. And he said, if you have art things that you need to do, just let me know where you need to go. So for the first year that I was out, I did a lot of networking. I did a lot of exhibits. I had a lot of speaking engagements, and I had things lined up for about 2 years into the future as far as exhibits, speaking engagements, and residencies. And then COVID hit, and every single one of those opportunities evaporated. And I went from feeling very secure about my future to living in my car in a field with a chicken on about $300 a month. And I was able to get a little part-time job for a period of time, but it wasn't enough to secure housing. So after when the job ended due to COVID, I looked at property and I found that I could buy 80 acres for $250 a month. So that's what I did. And I thought, well, I'm camping. So I bought 80 acres out in the middle of nowhere, and I have to haul water and, you know, anything that there's no electricity or anything. I have been this last 6 months, I've been collecting just discarded items and pallets and scrap lumber and just anything that people throw away to try to create a winter shelter. But this winter shelter does double duty because it is also a giant fish sculpture. So I am going to be living in a about 80-foot long deep sea fish constructed out of pallets. And right now I've got about a third of it, just the structure put together. So it's kind of like living in an open air pavilion right now. And it's very cold. It gets down to 16 degrees at night. And I have like 5 sleeping bags and 2 big dogs. And I'm just trying to survive, you know, out there. And it's been kind of interesting because people have asked me, you know, are you doing any art? And initially I was saying, no, I'm not, because I wasn't crocheting, I wasn't drawing, I wasn't doing any little sculptures that could be sold. But this entire building is a piece of artwork that people will be able to come and see and spend time in. And there will be satellite buildings that I start creating as soon as I'm finished with this one. And that's where I want to have workshops and have people come out and just, you know, it's a good wit gathering place because it's peaceful and it's beautiful. And you don't hear anything that has to do with humans or society. It's just, you know, the wind and the birds and the sagebrush and spectacular sunrises and sunsets. And also there's some roosters out there right now because I've been doing a sanctuary for inconvenient poultry as well. So they will be therapy animals. And I know people don't think of roosters as therapy animals, but actually they can be. So that's where I'm at and what I'm doing right now. You know, it's so far beyond thinking outside the box. It's hard to even characterize, but it's a level of freedom that I needed to experience after 13 years of incarceration and a bunch of years of abuse from before that.
Yeah. Wendy shared, you have a GoFundMe page called Desert Fish House. So if anybody wants to help fund Carole's project, I'm definitely gonna check that out. Ashley, there was another question. Would you consider Maryland a state that looks like they are ready for change in the law? And what can we do to help move Maryland forward in changing its laws?
It's not a state that I've heard anything about from legislators, but you know, if there's an advocate on the ground that's, you know, sort of willing to do that early work to try to see what legislators might be willing to sponsor a bill, you know, I would be totally on board with helping. I don't know if the person who wrote is an advocate or works for an organization that does criminal justice reform, but we, you know, we're certainly in the stage where we're very open to ideas.
Okay. Well, I will let that person chime in if they want to. Are there any other questions? You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions if you want to. There were no other questions in the chat box or comments.
If I may, just say something. It looks like that the prison system does not do the job of rehabilitation that it is meant to do. especially through interests such as the privatization of these kind of like prison systems for profit. And I was wondering for Ashley, do you know any efforts to like or to nationalize the US's prison system, where that the system will be more based upon like actually helping inmates to rehabilitate for society outside of it? And especially from what we heard of Carole's story, is that it really just feels like that the prison system just kicks them out, like abuses and re-traumatizes prisoners and kicks them out without any proper support, especially if there aren't any like the isolation experience from lack of communication with their families.
I know there are some. So I know Bard College works with women inmates, which is in the Northeast, on a writing project that is many years long, and has produced a book written by the women. But I wouldn't say the government is doing anything, but certain institutions and organizations are, certainly trying to pitch in. But it's a very heavy lift. I mean, the largest problem is there's just too many people in prison, for starters. So and there are people in there who would do much better out of prison and getting help. Carole would be a good example, and others too, where prison is not the right place for help. It's very but very much a setting for people who are a present danger. And, we just have so many people in there now, and we have this sort of unyielding way of looking at the crimes they committed that, if it's a murder, they must be dangerous. But what if it was a murder in self-defense? And the standards for that are so high, right? If the person who committed the murder ever was a perpetrator or was viewed as a perpetrator, then they could never ever be a victim. But that of course isn't reality. So we have a lot of work to do, but there are models around the world that we could easily look to. But it's very political in our country.
I think it's also very, especially here, it's very biblical.
Yes, I'm
everything's
sure
very
in Utah.
Old. Yeah, it's very Old Testament. It's an eye for an eye. Blood atonement, all that kind of stuff. And it's like the prosecutors made a statement in my case where they acknowledged that it was self-defense, but they added what they didn't know is what I must have said in order to create a situation where I needed to defend myself. And
that's so typical for blaming the victim in these domestic violence situations.
Yes,
you brought it on.
Yep. Well, I was on my way to a visit with my kids one day, and the officer asked me if I wanted to hear a joke. And, I said, sure. And he said, well, what do you tell a woman with two black eyes?
Oh, I've heard this joke. Yeah.
Yes. He's like, nothing. You already told the bitch twice.
Yeah. And there's variations on it as well. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And I can't. And so this is a law enforcement officer, right? This isn't just some random dude in a bar with no manners.
Yeah,
this
exactly. This is the attitude that you deal with, on a daily basis from the people that are controlling your life.
Go ahead, Will.
Sorry, if someone else has a question, they may go before me, but if there isn't, I also just want to, so like, as we see, like with a lot of the mistreatment and abuse that Carole has shared with us, we also saw this during this past year, like civil rights protests and riots, where we see that a lot of like primary sources, like videos shown on Twitter and other social media sites, that police will often, without cause or without like justified cause, harm individuals and then put the blame back on them. And what do see our media also, even as liberal or democratic they are, still also take the side of these institutions, of these like abuse institutions. I'm just kind of wondering, like, is there a way for, sorry, is there kind of a way for us to, I guess, perform local activism to kind of help, or to help bring people more aware of kind of like these abuses?
I'm not sure I fully understand your question.
Sorry, I know I went on a tangent. So I was just wondering, like, how, I guess more like how, sorry, I'm just trying to get my thoughts in order. So
Yeah, sure.
we see that there's a lot of kind of like fraternizing between these two systems, and I was wondering, like, as kind of like local members of the community, is there a way that we can, I guess, like kind of help to kind of combat these systems? Sorry if that still doesn't make sense.
No, I think what he's asking is, Carole is telling this shocking story, and we may have heard it peripherally, but not the way that I'm hearing it from Carole tonight. Like, what can people do to hold the systems accountable?
Well, I think, it's part of a larger conversation that has to be had, but I think we've put too much of the power into law enforcement's hands to handle domestic violence. And, that instead of all the funds being directed to arrest, all of those funds could be brought to communities that could actually help victims of domestic violence. We don't have enough shelters. We don't have enough free therapy. We don't have enough exit ramps out of marriage and troubled situations. Really the only resource is to call the police. And as Carole described, they're not super helpful. I don't know. What do you think, Carole?
One of the things that I think, as far as reapportioning funding goes, is that there needs to be less of a line drawn between victims and perpetrators, that we need to look at the perpetrators and offer them the same help that victims get. And there has to be an even ground there. You can't just throw somebody away no matter what they've done. You can't just shove them in the system and forget about them and then give marginal help to the victims, because there's really not that much help for victims. Both sides need therapy. Both sides need to be treated with some dignity and respect and care. And one of the things it's just a huge societal issue that being kind is seen as a weakness. And until we kind of get past that and actually look at things in depth, it's hard to make progress.
Yeah, it's a very big societal problem, but I'm really moved by the fact that you said both the victims and the perpetrators deserve help. That's really a very profound way of thinking about this. If there are no other questions, I'm gonna conclude this evening's program. I just really want to thank Carole for telling us such a personal story. I doubt that many of us have heard a story firsthand like that before. And thank Ashley Nellis for coming to us with information about the Sentencing Project. It does sound like there's ways for those of you who are interested in being more active and cause. It sounds like Dr. Nellis would be happy to provide you with some resources. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. And those of you who haven't come out to see the exhibit, it'll be up for a couple more weeks. So I do encourage you to come to the museum and view the artwork of the people who are involved in this.